So my lovely husband here knew that I'd probably be tired this week. And so I said to him, any chance you think you can preach for me? So he said he had a story on his heart that had been bubbling away this week, and he wrote it down. And so I'm going to share that with you this morning. It's based on Proverbs 17, verse 3, which says, the crucible for silver and the furnace for gold, but the Lord tests the heart. So wonderful. It kind of ties into our kingdom theme. And it's written like a children's story, so I hope you guys enjoy it. A long time ago, there lived a boy called Jeb. Jeb and his family lived in a cottage on the edge of a dark and scary forest. One day he saw such a beautiful butterfly that he followed it across the garden. He could not stop looking at it. Its colorful wings flapped from flower to flower. Jeb kept following it across the garden and into the dark forest. At first he did not notice that he was in the forest because his eyes were glued to the beautiful butterfly. We'll just wait. Okay, and we keep going. At first he did not notice that he was in the forest because his eyes were glued to the beautiful butterfly. But soon he noticed the shadows. He started feeling very scared and lost. Not knowing what to do, he decided to continue following the butterfly as it flapped from tree to tree. Jeb was about to give up hope. Tears were beginning to roll down his cheeks, and then he gasped. The butterfly had led him to a large open area. As he came out of the forest, he saw green rolling hills with flowers and bright little streams everywhere. The sunlight was playing on the water. It made the water look as if the streams were flowing with diamonds. Just beyond the edge of the forest, Jeb spotted a tiny little village. He was standing on a road that wound through the village. There were little stone houses on either side. The little houses had red roofs. Smoke drifted lazily from each little chimney. By now, Jeb was very hungry and tired, and he walked up to the first house and knocked on the door. The door was opened by a very old man holding a large hammer in one hand. He was very short, just a little taller than Jeb. He looked very skinny with a wrinkled face and a large red moustache drooped under an enormous nose. When he saw Jeb, he smiled and said, "Hello, little boy, what can I do for you?" Jeb was a little scared, but he managed to stammer, I'm Jeb." Once again, tears began rolling down his cheek. The little man smiled and opened the door. "Why don't you come on in and sit down, Jeb? You look a little hungry. Would you like something to eat?" "Yes, please," Jeb said eagerly as he clambered onto one of the chairs standing by a very old rickety table. The little man fussed about and before long placed a large plate of soft bread, butter, and delicious honey in front of Jeb. He also poured Jeb an enormous mug of creamy milk. As Jeb tucked into his food, he asked between bites, "What is Munch Munch, your Munch name?" "Well, my full name is Crew Clive Bill, or Crew C. Bill, as the mayor says it. I am the silversmith of this village." "What does a silversmith do, Mr. Crew?" asked Jeb, wiping his mouth with a sigh. He picked up the large mug of milk and started drinking. "A silversmith," said Crew, "takes silver ore and refines it until it becomes pure silver. Then he makes beautiful and useful things out of the silver. Things like mirrors or spoons or forks." He pointed to the mug Jeb was drinking from. "Your mug, for example, was made out of silver." Jeb stopped drinking to look at the mug. It had beautiful animals and flowers embossed all over, sparkling in their silvery brightness. "This is a very pretty mug, Mr. Crew," said Jeb. "It must have been really hard to make something like this." "Not so very hard, if you have the heart for it and if you know what you're doing," said Mr. Crew, smiling. "Come and see." And he led the way into his workshop at the back of the cottage. Jeb saw an enormous pile of rocks on one side with a blazing hot fire in the middle of the room. and a tiny workbench and anvil on the other side. "These piles of rocks have silver in it," Mr. Crew said, waving his arm at the pile of rocks twice as tall as him. "You can't see it, but the trick is to get the silver out of these rocks." With that, Mr. Crew picked up a shovel and quickly shoveled all the rocks into a large cauldron hanging over the fire, creating a great cloud of dust and steam. Next, he stoked the fire until it was blazing hot. The cauldron glowed, first a dull red, then a bright red, and finally became white with heat. "There," said Mr. Crew, wiping the sweat from his face with a big red handkerchief. "Now just to wait a little," and then he leaned over and, using his handkerchief so he didn't burn himself, he opened a really hot tap. Jeb stared as liquid, like molten lava, trickled into a small bowl on the floor. Next, Mr. Crew jumped into action again. He picked up a bucket and splashed some water onto the molten metal, and then he threw it onto his anvil, grabbed an enormous hammer, and started beating the metal until the sparks flew in all directions. "Now, just to knock out all that bad stuff," Mr. Crew grunted between blows of his hammer on the anvil. Great globs of slag flew off the anvil, but slowly the metal started taking on a silvery shine. Mr. Crew did not stop until it was all a lump of shiny, bright silver. "Aha, there," he said triumphantly. "Look how soft it is. The purer silver becomes, the softer it becomes. Now it's ready to make something out of it." And with that, Mr. Crew bent over his anvil, and with a frown of concentration, he started turning the lump of silver into an exquisite spoon. "That's really a small bit of silver for such a big pile of rocks, Mr. Crew," Jeb said with a puzzled look on his face. "Right you are, Jeb," Mr. Crew said without looking up from his work. "Silver is very precious, not just because it's so beautiful to look at, but also because it takes a lot of ore to make a little silver." Jeb thought for a while and then asked, "Is silver the most precious thing on earth, Mr. Crew?" No, Mr. Crew said, shaking his head. "You should speak to my neighbor, the goldsmith. He will show you something even more precious than silver." "Really? Something more precious than silver?" Jeb said excitedly. "Can I go over there now?" "Sure you can. Just tell him I sent you," Mr. Crew smiled and bent over his work again. "Thanks, Mr. Crew," Jeb shouted as he ran out the door to the neighbor's house. Jeb knocked politely. The door was opened by a very large man. Jeb looked at him and thought he must be a giant. He had a thick yellow beard, rosy cheeks, and his eyes were almost hidden by his smile. "Hi, Mr. Jeb said quickly. "My name is Jeb, and Mr. Crew sent me to see something more precious than silver." The large man chuckled. "Hello, Jeb," he said in a deep, booming voice. "My name is Ferdinand Ace, but the mayor just calls me Fernace." "Pleased to meet you, Mr. Fern," Jeb said politely. "Let me show you what I do here." And he led the way into his workshop. To Jeb's surprise, the workshop looked exactly the same as Mr. Crew. A pile of rocks on the left, but this pile was twice as big as the silversmith's. A large fireplace in the middle, but this one was twice as hot as the silversmith's. And a workbench with an anvil on the right. But on this workbench, Jeb saw the most exquisite items gleaming yellow in the firelight. He saw golden goblets, golden crowns fit for kings, and he saw rings and necklaces and golden chains. "Oh my," said Jeb in wonderment. "Are you a goldsmith, Mr. Fern?" Mr. Fern crossed his enormous arms and chuckled again. "Indeed I am, Jeb. Just like Mr. Crew, I extract precious metal from ore, but gold in my case, and once it is pure and soft and shiny, a deep, rich yellow color, I turn it into these beautiful items." "Is gold more precious than silver?" asked Jeb. "That's right, Jeb. Gold is more beautiful than silver, but there also must be less of it in the world, so it's more precious." "Is it the most precious thing in the world?" Mr. Fern Jeb asked. Now Mr. Fern smiled broader and chuckled harder than before. No, indeed, there's something far more valuable than gold in the world, Jeb. Can you show me, Mr. Fern? Jeb asked eagerly. I can't show you, Jeb. I'm just a goldsmith. Jeb's face fell and he looked down. But if you want to see the most precious thing in the world, you can go to the mayor. Jeb's face lit up again. He lives just down the road on the top of this hill. You can see through my workshop window. Mr. Fern pointed at the window. Jeb looked and saw how the road that ran through the town winds down the valley and up the hill. Right at the top, he thought he could see a cottage. Thanks, Mr. Fern, Jeb shouted, and ran out the door and down the road towards the mayor's cottage. The mayor's cottage was much further than Jeb thought at first. Not only that, but the hill was much steeper than it looked from Mr. Fern's house. Long before Jeb reached the mayor's cottage, he was puffing and sweating from exercise. He had long since stopped running. Now he was just focusing on putting one foot in front of the other as he went slowly up the hill. Jeb thought about turning back many times, but he kept thinking about those precious gold articles he saw in Mr. Fern's workshop. He so wanted to see what was more precious than those crowns and rings and necklaces, so he kept trudging along as best he could. Finally, he saw first the smoke, then the chimney, then the cottage itself. It appeared over the crest of the hill. As he went further, he saw that the cottage had a beautiful garden. There were flowers everywhere in a rainbow of colors and shapes. There was a delightful smell coming from all the flowers. In the middle of this garden, Jeb saw someone relaxing on the grass. That must be the mayor, thought Jeb. Hello, Mr. Mayor, Jeb said. My name is Jeb, and the goldsmith sent me to see the most precious thing on earth, more precious than gold or silver. The mayor raised himself up on his elbows and he smiled at Jeb. Jeb thought his smile reminded him of sunshine on a bright spring morning. The mayor had the friendliest face he ever saw. Hi, Jeb, the mayor said, and his voice reminded Jeb of the bright diamond streams bubbling cheerfully amongst the pebbles. It was the friendliest voice he had ever heard. I was expecting you, said the mayor as he stood up and brushed off the grass. A friend told me you were coming, and he pointed to a large, beautiful butterfly flapping from flower to flower. That's my butterfly, Jeb shouted in amazement. I mean, that's the butterfly that got me lost and then showed me this place. The mayor laughed, and to Jeb his laughter sounded like the song of many birds. It was the friendliest laugh he had ever heard. Quite right, Jeb. I sent him to you, and I'm glad you listened to him. I didn't know butterflies could talk, Mr. Mayor, Jeb said, confused. Indeed, they cannot, Jeb. Not the way we humans talk, but if you know them really well, you can find a way to talk to them. Come, let me show you the most precious thing in the world, more precious than silver or gold. And the mayor led the way into his cottage. The mayor's cottage wasn't much different from that of the goldsmith or the silversmith. If anything, the table and chair were older and more rickety than that of the silversmith, and the cottage was smaller than that of the goldsmith. You must be hungry from your walk, Jeb, said the mayor. Sit down and I'll give you something to eat. Jeb was grateful, and he sat down. He didn't notice himself getting hungry, but now he was hungrier and thirstier than he had ever remembered being in his whole life. The food came, however, it was just a plain chunk of bread and a mug of grape juice. But Jeb was so hungry that he started eating right away. Imagine his surprise when the bread was tastier than anything he had ever eaten, and the juice fresher than anything he ever drank. Once he started, he couldn't stop until he had eaten every crumb and drank every drop. When he finally put the mug down, he sighed. For the first time in his life, he did not feel a bit hungry or thirsty. He looked at the mayor in surprise and said, "Thank you so much, Mr. Mayor. That was the best meal I've ever eaten." The mayor smiled. He got up from the table and opened the door to his workshop at the back of the cottage. Jeb jumped up and eagerly followed. he peered round the mayor to see the most precious thing on earth. Jeb was dumbfounded. He expected a similar workshop to that of the silversmith and the goldsmith. And in a way it was similar, but then it was also very different. There was still a fireplace in the middle of the room, but this one was so hot Jeb could scarcely look at it. To the right there was also an anvil and a workbench, but instead of golden jewels and silver utensils, this workbench held something far more precious. Jeb stared and tried to make out what these objects were. As far as he could see, they were bright, big, shiny jewels. They were like diamonds, but shining with a light more wonderful than anything he ever saw. It was as if life and love were shining from them. He lifted one with both his hands. It felt comfortably warm in his hands and was surprisingly soft to the touch. Jeb remembered Mr. Crewe and Mr. Fern saying that the purer a precious metal is, the softer it is. He thought that this must be a very precious metal indeed, because it felt so soft he was afraid to squish it. The warmth spread throughout his body, and he felt a peace and love he had never known before. It was as if the sun had come up in his own heart and was kind of spreading its life-giving warmth throughout him until he glowed with the same light. Reluctantly and carefully he placed the object down on the workbench. He looked questioningly at the mayor. "These wonderful objects, Jeb," the mayor said, "is what you get when a human heart is purified." Jeb was confused. He looked at the mayor. "Sir, I don't understand." The mayor laughed. "I'll try to explain. In the center of every human soul there is a heart. It is from this heart that all thoughts, ideas, and decisions flow. My job is to purify these hearts. So if Mr. Crewe purifies silver and is a silversmith, and Mr. Fern purifies gold and is a goldsmith, then because you purify hearts, you must be a heartsmith," the mayor explained. "You're a clever boy, Jeb. Yes, I am the heartsmith, because I purify hearts." "But there are so many humans, Mr. Mayor. Why is it that a human heart is more precious than gold or silver?" "A human heart is quite common, Jeb, but it takes a very long time to purify one. And you've seen how beautiful a purified heart is. That is because it can love with a pure love. Gold and silver may be beautiful and rare, but they can be made into many fine and useful objects, but they cannot love. That is why a purified human heart is so precious. Gold and silver can last a very, very long time, but not so long compared to one of these," the mayor said, pointing to the shining gems lying on his workbench. "Any human who has one of these hearts will last for all eternity, and they all come to live with me forever." "But why do human hearts need to be purified?" said Jeb. They do not come from a pile of rocks like silver or gold, do they?" Jeb automatically looked to the right of the workshop, where he expected to see a pile of rocks like those of Mr. Crewe and Mr. Fern. Imagine his surprise when he saw a row of very tall shelves instead. The shelves were so tall that he could not see the top of them, and they were so long that he could not see the end of them. There were so many shelves it looked as if they went on forever into the distance. For the first time, Jeb noticed just how big the workshop was. It felt to him as if it would go on forever and ever. Then Jeb noticed what was on the shelves, and he jumped back in a fright. On the shelves there were hideous-looking lumps. They were roughly the same size as the beautiful gems on the mayor's workbench, but they looked moldy, they looked nothing like them. Some were slim and dark-looking, crawling with hideous worm-like creatures. Some looked like lumps of lead, some like jagged chunks of iron or steel. Some were in cages and snarled at him, covered with poisonous-looking fangs. Jeb felt the mayor's hand rest reassuringly on his shoulder, and he calmed down. "Don't be afraid, Jeb. They can do nothing to you while I'm here." He stepped forward and lifted one of the hearts that looked like a jagged piece of steel, and he looked at it, and Jeb saw his face soften with love. There were tears in his eyes. This heart has hardened herself against me, Jeb. That is why it looks like steel. Over the years, these jagged spikes have grown to keep me away. She does not know how cold it has become inside her heart. I will try to soften it up a bit so she can hear me when I knock. Gently and lovingly, the mayor placed the heart into the furnace. Jeb wondered how he could stand so close without being burned, but then he saw the scars on the mayor's hands and feet. He saw the love with which the mayor placed the heart in the very center of the blaze, and wondered how he could endure so much pain. The mayor stayed with the heart all the time it was in the fire. Jeb thought he saw him gently whispering to it the whole time. Finally, the mayor carried the heart back to Jeb. Jeb noticed that some of the worst jagged spikes had melted away, but the heart still looked dull and cold as steel. Now to knock at this heart, the mayor said, and he placed it firmly on his anvil. He picked up a hammer and gave it such a blow, Jeb thought it might have broken into 1,000,000 fragments, but it was still intact. Again and again the mayor struck it with his hammer. Sparks and fumes were coming from the heart of this dense cloud, and Jeb thought he saw the figure of a naughty and mean little girl forming in the cloud. He looked carefully. Now he could see she was teasing and bullying her little brother. The little boy started crying. Wham! A blow came down again on the heart, and the cloud broke up and reformed. Jeb looked at the mayor, but despite the force of the blow, Jeb could only see love and sympathy in his eyes, and were those tears starting to glisten in the corners. Jeb looked at the cloud again. The boy was still crying, and his sister was laughing a spiteful laugh. Suddenly, a giant hornet buzzed towards her and gave her a sting on her arm. She gave such a loud yell of pain and tried to get up, but she found she could not move. Her arm and face started swelling up like balloons as she collapsed onto the ground. Her brother stopped crying and wiped his tears. "Don't worry, sis," he said, concern on his face. "I'll run and fetch Mommy." The little boy ran as fast as his legs could carry him, shouting at the top of his lungs, "Mommy, Mommy, come quick, sis needs your help." Wham! Another blow broke up the cloud of steam and sparks again. When it reformed, Jeb saw the mean little girl lying in bed, but he was surprised to see her little brother sitting next to her and saying, "Don't worry, sis. The doctor says you'll get better soon, and I'll take care of you until you're well again." The little boy leaned over and gave her a little kiss. Jeb saw her spiteful face change in front of his eyes. It became softer, and a shadow of a real smile crept across it. "Thank you, my little brother," she said, and closed her eyes. And Jeb could see she would never bully her brother again. Wham! The fog broke up and dispersed for the last time. "There," said the mayor. "I think she finally heard my knock. This heart has made a lot of progress." Jeb looked at the heart. It was still very steely looking, but here and there he could see a shiny spot peeking through. The mayor picked the heart up carefully and carried it back to its place on the shelf. "I'll let it soften by itself for a while," he said. He took out his handkerchief and wiped his face. His eyes were red from tears, but he smiled a happy smile. "Right," he said, clapping his hands together. "Now we must put the final touches on this one." He strode over to the workbench and picked up one of the shiniest hearts lying there. "Not much left to do here," he said. He picked up a polishing rag and gently started polishing a dullish spot on the heart. The heart glowed more brightly, and in the glow, Jeb thought he saw an old man kneeling in prayer. He was so old and worn. Jeb thought he must be over 100 years old. "Hello, Master," the man said. "I think I'm ready to come to you now." The mayor gently placed the heart on a worn pillow lying on the floor and stepped back. "Sometimes I have to knock it very hard at the doors of their hearts for them to hear me, but sometimes the gentlest knock is enough. I think this one is ready now to come and live with me." Jeb looked at the heart. It glowed brighter and brighter, and in the glow it slowly transformed into the old man. And even though Jeb could recognize the old man clearly, he seemed to be getting younger and younger. The man looked up at the mayor, his face filled with wonder. "Master, is that really you?" The mayor ran forward and lifted the man from his kneeling position. "It is I," he said, and he hugged the man close. "Welcome, my son, you finally made it home to me." Tears of joy were streaming down their faces. The mayor led the man back into the cottage and through a small and narrow door. Jeb followed closely. He peeked through the door and saw a wonderful sight. Beyond the door was a green valley. It was incredibly beautiful, with large, cool green trees everywhere, branches heavy with flower and shiny fruit in all colors and shapes. Bright blue streams crisscrossed the valley. It was filled with the sound of birdsong, and beautiful animals of all descriptions were dotted here and there. Giraffes, elephants, antelope, lions. They were also people, such happy people, all smiling and walking or lying peacefully among the trees and animals. Close by the gate, Jeb saw a group of friends and family of the man with the purified heart. They were so glad to see him, and everyone gave him a warm hug. The mayor spent some time talking to everyone. He greeted each one and everyone by name and had a kind word for them all. After a while, he came back to the cottage. Jeb saw some children swimming in a bright blue lake. "Can I play with them, Mr. Mayor?" he asked. "Not yet, my Jeb. You still have much to do before you can come back to me. But one day you will, and then you can play as much as you want." He smiled and lovingly closed the narrow little door. Jeb thought for a while, and then he looked at the mayor and said, "Can I see my heart, sir?" The mayor sat down and put his hand on Jeb's shoulder. "You can if you really want to, Jeb, but are you sure you want to?" Jeb thought a bit. He remembered the times when he was mean to his brother and sisters. He also remembered times when he was lazy or disobeyed his parents. "Maybe not now, Mr. Mayor," he said after a while. "I think I'd like to work on it a bit first." The mayor smiled. "That's a good decision, Jeb, and you know I'll be helping you all the time. I am the heartsmith after all." He got up and walked out into his garden. "But it's getting late, Jeb. I don't want your parents to get worried. If you follow my friend the butterfly again, he will show you the way back to your house. I'll be waiting here for you when you're ready to come and live with me." The thought of his mom and dad made Jeb anxious to get home. "Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'll see you again someday," he shouted, and trotted after the beautiful butterfly as it flapped from flower to flower down the road. Jeb followed the butterfly through the dark, scary forest all the way back to his home. He was surprised to discover that very little time had gone by and no one had missed him. The first thing he did was pick a beautiful flower for his mum. Next, he said some kind words to each of his brothers and sisters. Finally, he went to see if he could help his dad with the chores. Jeb grew up to be a fine young man with a kind and soft heart. That doesn't mean he did not have difficult times. Perhaps he had more difficult times than some of us. But whenever he felt that things were getting hard, he would smile and think of the heartsmith standing with him in the blazing fire. Then he could almost hear the mayor whispering kind words to him. "I am with you in this difficulty, Jeb." He thought he heard the mayor say, "Not long now, and you'll be ready to come and live with me forever." The end. So, such a sweet little story. Yeah. Let's have a time of prayer now. Heavenly Father, we are just so grateful that you are the heartsmith in our lives, that you take our hearts, Lord Jesus, and you value them, and they are so precious to you, the most precious thing in the world. And you mold us and you make us into the likeness of your Son. Thank you for your kindness and your care for us, Lord Jesus. Thank you that you stand amidst the blazing fire of the trials in our lives, that we are never alone. And thank you that we have so much to hope in, so much to see us through these times and to know what's ahead of us, especially after a week where we've faced some grief. Thank you that we know where Heather is and she's with you. And we just pray that you would be with us in the weeks and days ahead, Lord. Continue to mold our hearts, I pray. We long to be shining bright hearts, soft and pure for your sake, so that we can touch the world with the great love that you have shown us. Such a privilege to be in your kingdom, Lord Jesus. We worship you this morning. Amen.